Okay, folks. So got lots of people coming on. That's awesome, and great to see such a large registration for the start of this academic year's suite of AGU AGI Heads and Chairs webinars. Really excited about this. We've got a big crowd, got great speakers, great topics. So we'll want to get to that as quickly as possible. Delaney, can you go next slide? So just quick introductions. Pranoti Asher, who is the Assistant Director of Grants and Education Programs at AGU, is my co-conspirator in this program. And I'm sure most all of you know her, and and then myself here at the American Geosciences Institute. In the background, we have Delaney Robinson and Leila Gonzalez here at AGI, who are trying to coordinate all the production side for today's webinar. And I'll turn that over to Pranoti now.
All right. Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all the panelists today and for everyone who is joining us for this very important conversation in the geosciences. I am so pleased to introduce our three wonderful panelists today. Rachel Beane, who is a professor at Bowdoin College. Many of you know her from her leadership from professional development programs in the geosciences. So she has been at sort of the leading edge of this effort for many, many years. Eric Baer, who's a faculty at Highline College, representing a two-year institution, has himself been a leader in supporting STEM and geosciences within the two-year colleges, and also working on quantitative studies for or problems and issues that students need to tackle in introductory courses. And last but not least, we have Vernon Morris, who is a faculty member at Arizona State University and the director of their School of Mathematics and Natural Sciences. And I know many of you know him from his sort of activist role to leadership in professional organizations. And the three of them represent very different kinds of institutions, and I'm so delighted that they're all three meeting together here in this forum to talk about this very important topic that is so critical to the survival of our geoscience enterprise. So without further ado, Rachel, take it away, please.
So many thanks to AGU and AGI for inviting us to share some of our work and thoughts, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation. The work we'll share began itself as a series of conversations last fall that centered around what we might learn from data on the diversity of undergraduate geoscience students. As Pranoti mentioned, my name is Rachel Beane, and I'm a professor of Earth and Oceanographic Science at Bowdoin College. I also have served as department chair and as associate dean at my college. Vernon?
Thanks, Rachel. My name is Vernon Morris. Also, I'd like to thank AGU for this opportunity as well. And just to add to something that Rachel said, those initial conversations, we learned as much from each other as we did from the data. And I think if you take anything away from this, expanding the diversity of your conversations and intellectual space is really critical to addressing the challenges that we have in geosciences. But Vernon Morris, I'm a professor at Arizona State University, current director of the School of Mathematical and Natural Sciences, and affiliate faculty in Global Futures, as well as the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology. Background in atmospheric chemistry, atmospheric sciences. So Eric.
Hi, I'm Eric Baer from Highline College, and I want to acknowledge there were several other co-authors on our original paper, and they had contributed to this tremendously. We would all also like to acknowledge the people whose land we are gathered on today. Many, if not all of us, are in parts of North America on the unceded lands where Native peoples made their homes and lives, and where their descendants continue to call home. Let us also acknowledge the robust indigenous communities made up of tribal diversity that originate from around the continent and whose journeys have brought them here and to other locations by way of forced displacement and seeking opportunities. Further, we respectfully acknowledge the enslaved people, primarily of African descent, who provided exploited labor on which this country was built with little to no recognition. Today, we are indebted to their labor and the labor of many Black and brown bodies that continue to work in the shadows for our collective benefit. Rachel, let you take it away from here.
Thank you, Eric. So today, the three of us will begin by sharing some of the race and ethnicity data for bachelor and associate geoscience degrees. We'll next turn towards outward-facing approaches, that is, those partnerships and actions that extend beyond a single department or program. Then we'll focus on inward-facing approaches. How can we approach diversity, equity, and inclusion through reflections and actions within our departments and programs? So last fall, we wanted to explore the race and ethnicity trends for undergraduates as a way to reveal issues. And our work was published this summer in Nature's open access publication. And as Eric mentioned, we're very grateful to all of our co-authors for many stimulating conversations over the year. That was the most valuable part, I think, for us as authors. So these two charts show the geoscience bachelor's degrees received in 1998 on the left and 2018 on the right. The data are from IPEDS, and we are using federal identity terms from that database, and recognize that those terms may differ from how individuals identify themselves. What stands out for me from these charts is that the combined percentage of geoscience bachelor's degrees received by racialized students increased by about a factor of 3 in 20 years. So that's from 7% of the total of 4,000 degrees awarded in 1998 to 21% of a total of 7,000 bachelor's degrees in 2018. So I find this encouraging, especially when compared to Bernard and Cooperdoc's study of geoscience PhDs, for which they concluded there was no progress in diversity at the PhD level. And I also see there's an opportunity for continued efforts, as the racial and ethnic profile of the undergraduate students is not as diverse as the US population is currently. So moving from this pie chart to a little bit more detail of what was happening between 1998 and 2018. So this graph shows the number, not the percentages as the last graph did, but the number of geoscience bachelor degrees by race and ethnicity from 1998 to 2018. So Vernon, Eric, and I will do some of what we did last fall, which was have a conversation. We'll share some of what we observed from the data.
Well, you would, yeah. You want us to dive in. So, yeah, I think one of the things that, we noticed here is one of the challenges in trying to capture identity by checking a box in a demographic survey. And so some of the categories change significantly, or continue to change significantly over time in terms of 2 or more races, and not being able to, how do you identify? And how you identify and as how we identify as people evolves, these numbers will change. And so you have hidden categories of identity that are not represented here in the other. 2 or more races, if you are mixed race and you appear dark-skinned, your experience will be highly racialized, but you may identify in another category. And these things are not well reflected, I think, in charts like this, but they are reflected in the experiences of individuals, especially individuals who might be highly isolated in their environments. But yeah, I don't want to dominate, but that's certainly one thing that's come out.
I think that these graphs also show an important thing, that there are places that there's a lot of progress, and there are also areas where there really is stagnant, and we need to look more critically rather than painting with a broad brush. Everything is either great or bad or good or improving or not improving, that it really, as you look more carefully at things, for instance, the Latinx group is increasing quite rapidly compared to even the US population. But there are other groups such as American Indian who have not, or Native Americans that have not changed significantly.
And among those that have, the change is significant. If we look at the blue, light blue dashed line for Latina students, so that has just, the huge growth between like 2010 and 2018. And that growth, we looked at what was the growth in terms of the undergraduate student body, and that growth in the geoscience students exceeds that of the undergraduate students. And then I also want to address one of the questions that was posed in the chat in terms of where are the white students on this? So if we look at, say, in 1998, that these racialized groups represented about 7% of the total geoscience degrees. If we included our white students on this, we don't see the variations that we wanted to pull out and to talk about today.
Yeah, I just also want to add that some of the growth that you see, you before we go on to the next slide at least, you see sort of an initiation of, or sort of a spark of growth at or around 2008. Maybe a little bit earlier, 2007. And one of the things that we discussed was the potential that these were linked to a few programs that have produced literally hundreds of graduates in the geosciences. There's a program funded by NOAA, the Educational Partnership Program, which was centered at minority serving institutions, but each one was a cluster of minority serving institutions. One was at Florida State, one was at University of Maryland Eastern Shore, one was at Howard, and one was at City University of New York. But each of these consortia individually generated hundreds of geoscience degrees, and primarily those degrees went to racialized students, Latinx, Native American, African American, Asian Pacific Islander. And at the onset of the first graduating classes of those, so they started in 2001, began to graduate students in 2005, 2006, and beyond. As they spun up, their spin up actually corresponds very well to the onset of the increases in a number of the categories here. And so we'll get to where the improvement or the progress is coming from a little bit later, but I think that's a signal of how strategic investments can lead to significant impact.
I think it's really important what Vernon is bringing up, and it also brings up that, we can look at this data, and for some, like the 2008 increase that Vernon mentioned, we can tie that to something that is happening, and that for other changes in the data, we have not yet been able to figure out, okay, what's leading to this, and so that we can learn from it. And I'm sure as a wider audience, including all of you, are looking at this data, that you might know some of, or have some ideas, hypotheses about what's behind that data and what we can learn from it and grow from as we continue. So while it's very encouraging that the proportion of US geoscience undergraduate students from racialized groups has increased, we also noticed that much of this progress currently is concentrated at relatively few universities. So we want to show you a little bit of that data. So we looked at institutions that had at least 3 graduates per year for the 5 years from 2014 to 2018. And by 3 graduates, I mean graduates with a bachelor's degree. And so the data plotted here show the number of institutions that averaged less than 1 to 2, or more than 2 Black or African American students for the left chart, and Hispanic or Latino Latina students for the right chart. So that's the data.
So just to weigh in, I think one thing, so these are the numbers, and it's important to have the quantitative information. And I think one of the things that we have emphasized is what are the stories behind the numerical data. And so if only 3% essentially of the schools are producing more than 2 Black students, 2 graduates a year, 18% more than 2 Latinx students per year, that signals a profound isolation for the majority of racialized students. I mean, you're alone. And if there's not, I think it's one thing to be profoundly alone, profoundly isolated. It's another to sort of be the target of efforts, positive or negative, because that again creates a stigma around your identity. And so I think there has to be great care in programs that have a number of students to be more intentional, but also when there's very few students or students are isolated, to not stigmatize their identity by individualizing your retention program or ignoring the retention program. But the type of isolation students are experiencing right now looks a lot like the isolation of the first students who desegregated classrooms in the 50s and 60s. And that's something that we have to be very intentional about.
So we're going to kind of return to this idea in a little bit, but we want to branch out our conversation a little bit now to, we've been talking so far about bachelor's degrees. And Eric, do you want to share some of the data for our community colleges?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think it was remarkable to me is to note that there was a pretty different composition of students depending on what degree level you looked at, whether it was associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, or other master's and PhD as well. And while the number of associate's degrees is very low, and that is reflective of these are associate's degrees strictly in AS degrees labeled geoscience, and most students that are transferring to bachelor's programs are not going to receive this degree. But what it does show is that at community colleges, the student population is typically much more diverse. And I think that it shows a potential for a source of students with a much greater diversity. Over a quarter of the students receiving a geoscience associate's degree were Latinx in 2019. So it leads us to look at perhaps working with two-year colleges or community colleges in order to diversify and to find students that are from a broader group. And I think, Vernon, you were going to talk about an ASU program to support that.
Oh, sorry, I was in the chat. Good questions in the chat, by the way. Yeah, I think one of the things that ASU is doing, and it has been, it has really strengthened our relationships with community colleges, two-year colleges, is enact a reverse transfer program for some of the students coming in. And what that does is it validates what their experience has been at the two-year college. It gives them a sense of completion because they can complete those degrees, and it reduces that risk that they feel in making the transition. As we know, attrition at the transition points, moving from high school into undergrad or two-year college, from two-year college to four-year college, from four-year college to graduate school, from graduate school into the profession. There's huge turnover at those points, and we tend to acknowledge that turnover as just part of the STEM experience. Some people aren't cut out for this. Some people aren't going to make it. We're an exclusive program. But the attrition is highly differential. It's highly racialized. It's highly gendered in many cases. And so I think that's an example of how we can meet students where they are. What are they feeling are the risks? What are their values at those stages of transition? And how can we adapt so that we can meet them where they are, reduce their perceptions of risk, support them, and value what their work has been up to that point. And I think when you do that, you increase retention and their sense of belonging, and ultimately you increase the number of successful folks in STEM and in geosciences. Sorry for my back and forth. I can't be in the chat and in the discussion at the same time. There's too many good questions in the chat.
Vernon, I think you were going to continue with a couple more examples here, as we're also asking for those in the chat if there are things that have worked for your institution or there have been successes or challenges. Please, we'd love to learn more, and I'm sure that everyone here would like to hear more too.
So yeah, I think one of the positive stories here, and we don't want to paint up, I think Eric said, it's not all a negative picture, is that there's successes. There's a number of successes in certain places. There has been improvement. At the HBCUs and minority serving institutions in particular, there have been investments that have grown programs where there were no programs before. And that's increasing access, it's creating new populations of students. And so I think when we think of outward facing approaches, it would be strategic to leverage those successes, either through partnerships or through knowledge transfer and sharing, through resource sharing. But those partnerships should not truly be transactional. Hey, send me your students, or hey, what did you do so I can put that in my proposal, or at the 23rd hour, hey, do you want to be on this proposal? But actually developing relationships with those programs, those institutions that have shown successes in recruitment and retention and graduation, and building more bridges. And so I think as I said, the institutions that have been associated with the Environmental Partnership Program with NOAA, which is entrenched in geosciences, those schools are quite often looking for partnerships that make a lot of sense. I think we've got to also think about different forms of partnership and distributing leadership in ways that the partnerships are more rewarding for those institutions that may be smaller, that may be two-year institutions that have differential teaching loads. And how do you structure the partnership where it's mutually rewarding, not just for what you perceive of the students having a greater opportunity, but for the faculty to have intellectual investment and time to contribute those intellectual investments. And that requires a different type of thinking. But I think there's a few partnerships out there that are working and can work.
Yeah, we've heard of some of those partnerships, like a number of institutions, and so some of you might be on this call from those institutions and feel welcome to share those partnerships that have worked, or steer us towards an article or a piece or a blog that kind of describes them, because I feel like there's a lot that we can learn for our departments and our institutions in terms of what makes a good partnership and what sustains that partnership as well. So at this point, we might turn back from the outward facing towards a little bit more of the inward facing, and recall how Vernon described that racialized students in most geoscience departments are isolated. There's a question in the chat in terms of like how does it vary based on percentages? Yes, we looked at that too in terms of if a department was graduating so many students, what percentage of them were. But the part that we really, why we showed this particular diagram is that we really wanted to point out that many are going to be very isolated in their departments based on their race and ethnicity, and to really consider what we are going to do about that. And meanwhile, I'm liking that I'm seeing some various community college partnerships popping up in the chat. I look forward to reading them more, more closely as we go on. So as I mentioned, we want to look outward, we want to look for partnerships, and we also want to look inwards. And so we want to examine what we are doing and what we can change within our own departments, and what we as chairs and heads of departments can leverage. And so this slide shares some examples of what we might do in our own teaching, and that we could encourage our department members also to do in their teaching. So these recommendations are based on a study of the NAGT Geoscience Faculty Survey. So Karen McNeil, Heather McDonald, and I sought to look into the extent to which geoscience faculty report using education practices that support inclusion. And so that's based on published literature of what's working in the sciences to support inclusion, and what we could find in the survey that matched that. So from the survey, we chose 26 items that related to inclusive practices and completed factor analysis and univariate modeling. And one of the takeaways from our study was that generally less than half of the geoscience faculty reported using any one of the inclusive strategies. So that suggests there's a lot more that we can do in our classrooms and our departments to create inclusive learning environments. It can include some of what's listed here, such as active learning, incorporating issues such as environmental justice, supporting students with metacognition, self-reflection approaches, and providing information on careers not only to our majors, but also to our intro students so they know the potential of what's there. And I recognize that there's a whole bunch more inclusive practices. And so I think part of what we need to do is that sharing ideas and strategies. We're doing some of that in this forum here. It's one of the things that made our fall conversations useful among Vernon, Eric, and our co-authors. And so we really want to look at that as a possibility to look inward as what we're doing in our department. So before we open up it to kind of a larger conversation, Vernon or Eric, do you want to share any of your insights as to what department chairs might do, or how individuals in a department can leverage kind of their position?
Yeah, I think it's critical for leadership to be very explicit and clear in languaging. I think as a former chair and as a unit director, school director now, I think it's good to have your diversity statements and sort of broad articulation of value, but that has to be connected to policy. And it has to be clear that if you value equity, if you value inclusion, diversity is just an indicator of whether you've been effective in being inclusive, in being welcoming and generating a sense of belonging. So it's an indicator. It's not a goal. And so one of the things I think as a leader is you've got to de-emphasize diversity. And I say that at risk. I understand that. But diversity is a measure. And so when you say diversity is my goal, what happens is you bring in a racialized person, and now that we've diversified, if it's a business imperative, diversity is, we need to do diversity because it makes you more creative, it makes you more productive. If you focus on diversity in that way, then now the onus is on that person, because now they're part of a group. If my unit isn't better, it's their fault. And this thing is wrong. We don't need to do this anymore. And so we've got to shift, one, sort of our mindsets using language to focus on the things that are important and not make it purely a business imperative. Equity is not a business imperative. Equity actually is a moral imperative. And I think you've got to build it into policy. It has to, if there's no reflection of the value of equity, the value of inclusion in policy, in reward structures, in promotion, not just for the junior faculty, but for your most prestigious faculty, your full professors, for everyone across the ranks, then it's not going to be sustainable and it won't be successful in the end. So I think chairs play a role in setting the tone, in setting policy changes, along their path. And I think that's where you have to make an impact as a leader. And there's no other way around that. That makes it the job even tougher. Chair is a tough job. I know that. But this is the tough work that needs to be done. Some of it.
So I would add, which thank you, Vernon, that was beautifully said, that one of the things that I learned from looking at this data was that it is hard, but it is doable. There are institutions that are successful, and they are successfully both making partnerships, looking outwardly, but also inwardly, that are supporting and helping students thrive from all of these rather flawed ethnic and racial categories. And it's not easy. Clearly, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. And certainly it's not, which tells us that we need to put an incredible amount of sustained effort into this. And it can't just be, oh, I'm going to work on it this week or at this moment. It has to be throughout. And as chairs, I think that having that sustained effort to work in your program to evaluate and support culture to build those relationships and help students be successful from a wide variety of backgrounds, as well as creating and sustaining long-term those partnerships. It's hard, but it's doable.
Yeah, and I think I was talking with some faculty at a reception yesterday, just a quick personal anecdote. We just started 2 new programs at ASU, a Presidential Scholars Program that attracts postdocs of color. We're aiming for 50 a year and 50 graduate students of color. So we just kicked off those programs. And actually, the full anecdote is I walked into the reception, and I'm going to MC this reception of these 2 programs that I helped develop and co-lead the implementation. And as I was walking in to try to get to the podium, someone sort of came up to me and sort of said, "Hey, are you a student, a postdoc, or staff?" Now that's a microaggression. That's a classic microaggression. I'm not only a full professor, but I actually created these programs. Professor was nowhere in the question. Okay. Now that may be minor, but what if this happens to you every day or 3 times a day? And if instead of being a privileged full professor director of a unit, you're the one student in the program. And the message that you're getting is, do you belong here? Do you belong here? Do you belong here? Do you belong here? And so leadership needs to express this message to everyone in the unit. It's easy to walk up to someone and say, welcome. Hey, how are you doing? Really love to be here at this program. Really excited about this. What's your relationship to the program? You're going to get the same information, but you're going to get it in a way that's going to be less oppositional. And there have to be people articulating, here's the way to do that. Talking to one of the professors there, and they were saying, you know, there's a lot of people who want to be allies. They want to be better allies. They want to be engaged in this, but they are so afraid of making a mistake that they don't know what to do. And my response to that was, start by just showing up to the reception. Okay. Frankly speaking, we had a reception that was well attended by our white female professors. There was one white male professor there. And this is a program that the president has invested multi-year investment of millions of dollars. And I guarantee you that if it was any other program like that, it would be well attended by folks who are looking for money. And so I think one piece of advice that chairs can advocate for, everyone show up to the table, because this is an all hands on deck problem. It cannot be the onus on women faculty, female faculty. There's already an onus on them of diversity work. It can't be on the students and postdocs. It can't be on the racialized faculty. It's all hands, and the chairs are at a level where they can say, I need to see this in everybody's portfolio. And so, you know, what can you do? Show up and be ready for some work. Because just like any other difficult problem that we all like to dive into in geosciences, this is one of geoscience's most difficult problems. So let's all get to work on it.
I appreciated how Vernon described it as chairs and program directors really setting that expectation that everyone shows up. And I was thinking about how the chair of my department has been doing that for the past couple of years, is to incorporate a discussion of inclusion, looking at data right into our department meetings for a start. So we've looked at data on student demographics, not only race and ethnicity demographics, but on a broader scope. For our introductory courses, our major courses, for our independent studies that students do. We've also looked together at grade variations in courses based on the student demographics, and it can be surprising and it can really stimulate a lot of conversations, as well as she gave basically a climate survey to those students in our department and had conversations with them. And so we are learning from that, and then that creates an opportunity and expectation that we do something with it, right? That we act from that data, we learn from it, and we move forward. So I think that those are really important things that we do. So I like some of the suggestions that have been going back and forth, the questions, and then the kind of responses in terms of what's working or what has been tried as an institution. And some of those programs are beyond the geosciences, but more inclusive of STEM fields at an institution. And so we really wanted to open it up here in terms of, as a department chair or program head, what are you doing or what will you do to transform the department culture, to build relationships, and to change policies and procedures. And definitely welcome it in the chat, but it also, I think, is possible to raise your hand, and we can have our AGU and AGI hosts help us with calling on people to share verbally for this last part of this session as well.
Chris, do you want to go back into the beginning of the chat to find some questions that have not been asked? It feels like some of them have been answered in the chat, but maybe we want to moderate those.
Yeah, I just put something in as the JEDI plans are developed. You know, one way of making sure that you've got something that's relevant is to have it independently reviewed outside of your department by folks in your DEI office, by the affinity groups on your campus, the Black, Graduate Student Association, or, what have you. Make them available before you canonize them and say, okay, is this on the right track? Can we get some feedback on this? Instead of sort of doing it within a group that fundamentally is doing it because they need help in diversifying. So if you create it sort of in a vacuum, you might have blind spots. And so if you share that before you canonize that with people with expertise, either experiential expertise or scholarly expertise, you might come up with a better plan, a more actionable plan, a more contextual plan. So I always advocate, share it out, get some feedback from people who've been through the program. If you've got racialized alumni who've gone through your program, put them on an advisory board to help you, guide you to, hey, this was my experience. This is what made it rough. Here's some advice on how it could be better. And they're probably in a better position to be frank and honest once they're through, hopefully not bitter, but then when they're there and feel like I can't really speak because I'm at a particular position in this power hierarchy. I also, since we've got a pause, colleague of mine and I use a term called unicornification. A lot of times, because there are so few graduates of color who go through a program, that they're sort of focused on in a way that says, look, you can be a success, look at this person over here, not taking into account what they had to go through to get to that point, and that it's kind of a unique experience to go through a program in an isolated way and make it to the other end and still continue. And so that, I think, emphasizes sort of this John Henryism, or this, martyr, ideal. I'm going to get through this thing for hell or high water, regardless of how horrifying or terrorizing it is. And that's okay. That sort of validates the system staying in place. And so we do want to, value the folks who make it through the system as it stands, but not use them to validate the system as it stands. And because that turns off other students. I can say that from my own experience when I talk to students, when I was at Howard about my experience going through, they're like, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go through that. So, good for you, but I can't do that. And I realized that you got to change the process and not just force people through the system. And so I appreciate the comments that people are changing things, but also be aware of how we value the success within the system as well.
So I'm going to make a recommendation here. Looking at the chat, it's a wide-ranging conversation, and I think if you feel your question hasn't really been answered in the chat, please raise your hand. Let's open up the mics. I'm going to take moderator prerogative here, and a question for all you guys. When I look at how these transformations are are largely, are trying to be driven through. It's sort of this, the department is trying to engage with the student communities, and it's sort of under this institutional umbrella. Are there examples or are there strategies where you are pairing up with other academic departments, peer departments on the campus, preferably outside of the sciences, like over in the social sciences or other areas, to sort of leverage the different strengths, not so much to try to cross recruit or anything like that, but those programs, those approaches, those attitudes, things like that, because on a university, you are literally in a sea of experts. And I'm just curious if there's some examples of that.
I think that's really important and something that, as we talk about talking, beyond our department with geoscientists, it means also talking within our institution and recognizing all that people bring. So at my institution, we've done it certainly within STEM, but in those conversations, we've invited others who have expertise in other departments to join us. The other way that we've done it is to really look at, and I've seen this in the chat as well, to really look at the policies and procedures, especially around tenure and promotion, about what constitutes good teaching, and to work collectively at our institution, multiple departments, to really change things. And we've made changes recently that have been voted through, and I see in the chat that other institutions have as well. And I know that there's others who can offer some explanations and examples as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example of, looking at other departments' promotion and tenure guidelines that include public-facing work. Because a lot of times, students are doing great work in environmental justice or connecting with communities and exchanging science with communities. Schools of public policy do this all the time and value that public-facing work. But if you're in a chemistry department or a meteorology department, typically you're not familiar with how to reframe your P&T guidelines to account for that. But by communicating with other programs that have that expertise or already have that built in, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can just, hey, let's look at that. What of that could work here to allow for a more intellectually diverse way of looking at scholarly work? Because I think you're absolutely right. Within the university, scholarly work is a spectrum, extremely rich spectrum of activities. And we should be thinking broader than, not at the exclusion of, but broader than just, publications and presentations, grant funds, etc. There's other ways of making significant impact in the geosciences.
So I'm going to encourage our audience. It's been great conversation, lots of good chat. Please, any additional questions? Perfect, Maureen.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much to the panelists. This has been just an amazing discussion. I'm a new chair as of this semester, and I'm still very much finding my footing. And I'm sitting here looking at this slide. What will you do to transform department culture around some of this? And I'm thinking, especially of the point you made, Vernon, where looking around at kind of who shows up to the receptions and the committee meetings and whatever, and it is often minoritized faculty, women faculty. As chairs and people in leadership roles, what advice would you give us for changing the culture around that? Because some of the a lot of the incentives that, at least at my university, stuff like faculty activity reports, that happens on a level above me. How about changing the culture at the grassroots level? What advice do you have for us?
Well, one of the things that we've started here, so I'm in a new position, new unit, new university. And so one is opening up. We have a series of faculty conversations around race, around sense of belonging, around decolonizing the curriculum, that we not only do within mathematical and natural sciences, but we partner with the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, as well as the School of Humanities, Arts, Humanities and Arts, Cultural Studies. And so we get these very rich conversations across, as I said, with the group with Eric, Rachel, and our other co-authors. Sit down with an intellectually diverse group who understand race and sense of belonging and the academic experience in different ways. You got to create a safe space and just have conversations. And so we've been, relegated to Zoom because of the last couple of years, but what we found is we've retained a really high participation rate. People even asked to be in the same breakout rooms as they, were the last, 2 sessions ago because they didn't finish the conversation. And so we're trying to think of ways of how to bridge between these conversations, but starting conversations that allow your faculty to discuss things that they don't discuss, or they discuss in sort of one-on-one echo chambers that doesn't lead to, productive intellectual growth. And so URGE has a system that is collective reading of papers and things like that, and I think that's good. I think there's a number of models that you can have, but you've got to get people talking about uncomfortable or difficult subjects and saying the purpose of this is not just to be uncomfortable. It's to have an impact on our culture and on the design of this unit going into the future, which means a policy change is going to come out of this. And so, use the data to identify where there are challenges, and then you use the discussion to drive the development of policy to address those challenges. And you're really, as a chair, this is what we're doing. This is what we're going to do this semester. This is what we're going to do. So I think that's part of the strategic plan of the unit, and you articulate that we're going to be a leader in equity. We're going to be a leader in inclusion, right? It's not, and so then through those discussions, I've been pleasantly surprised by what people bring to those discussions after they've relaxed enough to open up in those spaces. And for me, it means I have to show some vulnerability. I have to tell some personal stories and say, look, this is the reality of being me in this space. And I've been in this space for a while. But that has led to some good progress, I think, individually as well as through the unit.
That's great. Michael, you have your hand up.
Hi, aloha, everybody. Fantastic. Really enjoying this. I wish we could spend a week at least talking about this stuff. And one thing I want to ask our speakers, and maybe this is coming from a really ignorant position, but with the inherent, and these, several times the word flawed has been used in terms of, how do we manage the data? How do we manage what it's saying? Given how much work that you've done, is there any discussion or thoughts about ways that we could perhaps create a better composite measure of these type of issues, where inclusion of socioeconomic measures, income, neighborhood affluence, first generation college, other elements could be brought in? And the reason I asked that, because it really hit home, especially some of the things that Vernon said about, we're using these racial and ethnic classifications, and unintentionally at times, those are actually hurting our efforts, what we're trying to do. And so if we could slightly adjust how the students are viewed, and by doing that also inherently adjust how we view our efforts, then we might create systemically create a more not just equitable but inclusive set of efforts. So I don't know if that makes sense, and I'm really trying to formulate in my mind what I mean, but hopefully that's enough to kind of get the thought across. And I'd just like to hear what the panel has, if anything, in terms of that thought.
So I'm going to answer this because I've worked with a bunch of faculty at two-year colleges primarily to do that. And typically when you're looking at from within your institution, you can get data far beyond what is available nationally. And that includes things like Pell Grants. So you could look at, are you serving students in a equitable way that are receiving Pell Grants? So that gets at some of that socio-economic diversity. You can look at age data. Your institutional research office can help you with that, and many other ways of looking at, are you treating students and are you serving students in an equitable way? And they may be able to help you look, do you have an unusual distribution compared to your institution? Are students of a certain, say, of lower socioeconomic status, are they not succeeding as at a different rate in your classes and that sort of thing? So.
So we can look at that from an institutional level. I guess what I'm asking is, how do we create, perhaps, if there is a need, how to create sort of an updated measure that includes all of that, but that we can, instead of looking at it from just a purely institutional way, or is there a way that we can aggregate then the efforts across the country, all the data in that way, in sort of in an updated measure that includes all of that? Or are we sort of kind of stuck with the way the system currently is configured, that we can't do that?
There is a lot of data out there, and I think there's abundant room for other people to examine that data in many other ways.
Yeah, I'm wondering if what you run up against, Eric, and you probably can answer this, you run up against the federal definitions of things and how those are changing in time. Individually, you don't have control over that. And so I think at the national level, GAO or, OMB are saying, here are the designations, here's how we're going to collect data. So in the aggregate, you're limited on what you can get to. But I think in terms of strategic partnerships at the institutional level, you can get a lot of data. And so you can work through all the state schools and say, okay, hey, here's what the picture is in Arizona based on, granular data that can really help you say, this is what we need to do here. Because I think you lose context the higher up you go. And so, whereas if we had all the data at the national level, that would be great. But would that help you design a solution that's going to work in Connecticut? Well, probably the Connecticut information is going to help you design that solution. So I think start where you are and branch out to similar institutions, or I think you can get to what I think you're asking for there.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. This was an outstanding conversation and very, very informative. With this, I'm going to hand this back over to Pranoti to help us on the wrap up.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Vernon. This was a phenomenal conversation with our community. And I hope we can meet up again next year to continue the talks and see what else comes from this chat, which has been so rich, Maybe there's an opportunity here for us to collectively somehow publish these solutions that are happening at very granular levels. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming. Of course, if you know someone who missed the webinar, a recording will be available. If you're interested in asking other questions of these panelists but don't know them, feel free to send them to me. I'll be happy to share them with either of them or all of them. And if you are a department chair or new department chair, you're welcome to join the Heads and Chairs community and participate in workshops at the fall meeting and in other and in future webinars with the AGU and AGI. And with that, we'll go to the last slide, which shows our next webinar that is coming up next month. We're going to be talking about teaching. So some of the practices that you were talking about, Rachel, we're going to explore those to see, what many faculty have done across the country. And of course, if you have missed previous webinars, you can watch the recordings on this link, and you can register for future webinars. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.